story of the feeding of the 5,000 is a familiar one to honestly almost anyone, Christian and non-Christian alike. It's typically the first miracle that we think of when asked, and it is one of the most familiar images of Jesus. Now, this story occurs 6 different times in the 4 Gospels. In Matthew 14 and 15, in Mark 6 and Mark 8, it is in Luke 9 and John 6. It is, and I want you to hear this, it is the only miracle story in all 4 Gospels except the story of the resurrection. It's also in 2 Kings. This tells us a few things. It tells us that this story is pretty darn important. It tells me that this story had a pretty big impact. This story where people have gathered for Jesus throughout the day, but it's getting late and the disciples want to send them away, but instead Jesus takes 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish and performs a miracle where everyone is fed with food left over. It's nice, isn't it? But we skipped over a few important details. And the first one is easily missed, so easily that I really had never, ever noticed it before, because it seems so obvious and so rational, and quite frankly, so unlike the disciples. So it was getting late, and the disciples had concerns about feeding this many people in a deserted place. But I have to ask, how deserted could this place really be if there were so many people around? Luke tells us that the town that Jesus was ministering in that morning was the town of Bethesda. Now here, pull down the map, right? Israel, Sea of Galilee. Bethesda is a town on the north side of the Sea of Galilee. It is the hometown of 3 disciples, Peter, Andrew, and Philip. Does anyone remember what Peter, Andrew, and Philip did? They were fishermen. Does anyone know what the Sea of Galilee is filled with? Right. Slimy fish. Now this gets me wondering, because again, Matthew 4:19 tells us that Peter, Andrew, and Philip laid down their nets and followed Jesus. And Jesus says, I'm going to use the gendered one because it's just more poetic, that I will make you fishers of men. So immediately they put down their nets and they are followed. Nets to me imply that there are a lot of fish in the sea. Yet the disciples called it a deserted place, which is such an interesting phrase and one I'd never picked up on before now, maybe because of all the work we'd been doing around food access and people asking questions like, why do I have access to over 6 grocery stores in as many miles in my suburban neighborhoods, while there are neighborhoods in downtown Baltimore with none? Yes. How often do we call that a food desert? Now, I want to pause here because I'm using food desert to lift up this example, but I want to note that there's a woman named Karen Washington who points out that we really shouldn't call it a food desert because deserts are naturally occurring. Now, maybe you've heard this, but she argues that what we should actually call it is a food apartheid. We should call it an apartheid because just like redlining or covenant communities, it was a decision to not put good, fresh, accessible, affordable food in areas where people needed it. It is a food apartheid. Yet, reading this, and again, the disciples are saying, we have to send the people away because this place is a food deserted place. There is no access to food here, in other words. Yet it is not naturally occurring that there is no food there. In fact, the sea is full of fish, and the bread that is milled from the water would be available except. This area of town, this part of Israel, is an occupied land by the Roman authority. The taxes that are demanded and often make it a reality that the fish that the people catch, they can't actually even afford to buy. They are salted and barreled and shipped off to the Roman cities. What makes this statement that Jesus is saying even more preposterous, this idea you give them something to eat, first off, let's pause here for a second. There are 5,000 men, Matthew says. Or I'm sorry, Luke says. Luke, John, and Mark say there are 5,000 men. Matthew's version is the only one that acknowledges that maybe there might be women and children around. Just maybe. So if we take this, I'm going to just take this idea that maybe there are like 2.5 members of a household or something, which bring us to about 25,000 people that the disciples have to feed. That's a lot of people. So we're talking about a 6-month salary, maybe more. And y'all, let me tell you, it's been a while since any of these disciples drew a salary. This is a lot of money, let alone a lot of food that probably these towns couldn't even accommodate. We're talking about so much money that they have never seen before, and the villages would have never been able to accommodate, to feed them all. It'd be like if every single person on every day went out to eat at the same time in the same 3 restaurants. How on earth could they expect to pull this off? They point out, we only have 5 loaves and 2 fish between us, and we know the rest of this beautiful story. This is a miracle story. It is so important of a miracle that they put it in the Gospels 6 different times. It is a miracle of multiplication. Jesus multiplied the bread and multiplied the fish, and there was so much for everyone to eat that they had 12 baskets left over. A miracle of multiplication. But I want to actually go back to the text for a second, because the text never says that Jesus multiplied the bread and the fish. It doesn't say that the bread lasted through the crowd as the miracle. It said that Jesus blessed the bread and the fish and gave it to the disciples to set before the crowd as an offering. The miracle of the loaves and the fishes isn't actually a miracle of multiplication. Jesus doesn't have a moment where he multiplied the food. And so, if it's not a miracle of multiplication, then what is it a miracle of, you ask? Now, y'all, I have given this sermon, and quite frankly, it's a good one, on the miracle of sharing with your neighbor, because every single one of those were fishermen or shepherds in that area who grazed in the mountains, and they had bread and salted fish, and everybody had that in their bag, and they took it out and they shared, and that is a beautiful story, and I love that story, and I love that sermon, but it's not quite a miracle. I mean, in 2024, the idea that we would have that spirit of abundance, of sharing, might feel like a miracle, but it's not exactly a miracle from God. So if it wasn't multiplication, Shannon, and it wasn't people sharing the miracle, what is the miracle? Why is this story so important to our faith? Here's what I know about God. God is not so interested in ownership. God is interested in stewardship. God doesn't really care about where the bread and the fish came from. God cares that the people were fed. But even more than that, Jesus has shown compassion to the crowds. He's cured their sick. He did it in Bethesda, and he'll do it before he's going on to the next place. And at some point, he looked around on his journey and he said, there's a hole in the bottom of the bucket. You will not always have me with you. I am one man, yes, the Son of God, but I can't do it all myself. I can't own this myself. We have to be good stewards of one another. We need a new way of living. We need a new way of dividing ourselves up and a new kind of leadership. This is the interesting thing about Luke's version of the story. It is the only version where Jesus commands them to put them into groups of 50, to organize the crowds differently. He taught them that when you look at 25,000 people, it's not personal, it's overwhelming. But in smaller groups, you're not going to say no to someone who has nothing when you have plenty. Jesus taught them how to organize a new way of being stewards of one another. Jesus models this and then asks it of his disciples and asks it of the crowds. Not only does he not send them away when things get hard, but he organizes them and elicits their help in the process. Jesus is saying we can't do the things that we've always done the way that we've always done them. The way that we've always done them is to send them away. The new thing that we have to do is adapt. Don't send them away. Sit down. Find a new way together. When I was in seminary, we were asking a question: can the church as it exists today survive? Now, that was only 20 years ago when we were asking this question: can these bones live? Now, 20 years later, I think we have not only asked that question, but we have answered that question. And the answer is no. We have to face the reality that we need to find a new solution to the problem. We have to stop praying for a miracle of multiplication. If we just had more young people, more money, more helping hands, more energy, if we just had more, maybe we could feed the people. The miracle of the loaves and fishes teaches us not to pray for a miracle of multiplication, but to give the blessings to God, because God has given us all that we need, even if it just feels like 5 loaves and 2 fishes to a crowd of 25,000. How we're going to get there is dependent on each and every one of us digging our hands in the dirt, asking how we can help. It means not running or sending away when things get hard, but solving the problem together. You give them something to eat. You don't need to send them away. A new kind of leadership, an adaptive one, Jesus says. And friends, I'm telling you, it's not coming in the generation behind you. It is here in this room. You have already everything you need to ask the tough questions. What you need to do is to adapt to the hungry crowds in front of us today. What kind of leadership do we need to cultivate to stand up to the injustices around us? And how are we going to use the resources we already have to do it? The challenge for us today is to stop spending our energy waiting on a miracle of multiplication and start digging into the hard work of the miracle of adaptation Jesus is calling us to. Friends, this is the miracle of the story, is that through God, all things are possible. And we are part of the possibility. Friends, may it be so for you and for me. And all God's people said,